Hello everyone, tonight I'll be narrating 3 new creepy posts that I found off of the Let's Not Meet subreddit. After you've heard these stories, let me know what you think of them in the comments below, you be the judge. But without further ado, let's dive straight into their experiences.
These are their stories.
Okay, so I've had a few issues with my next door neighbors since I moved in, but nothing creepy until just recently. There is a man, a woman, and at least one boy living there, and I mostly just avoid them. The man seems okay but a bit weird, and the boy just keeps to himself, and the woman is quite a bit off. Not long after we moved in, she left a note in my mailbox. Our mailboxes are right beside each other, between our houses. Anyway, I stood at the mailbox reading the note. She thought that my dog was using the bathroom in her yard. It was possible, as our fence had some holes in it, that our dog had gotten out then, but those holes had been fixed a long time ago. Still, no big deal, except I noticed her standing in her driveway, just staring at me, and the note was very long. I just kept reading it. The more I read it, the crazier it got, and the weirder her behavior in my peripheral vision became. Apparently I was entitled. She seemed to think I was somehow instructing my dog to use the bathroom in their yard. Her note went on a tangent about how awful dogs are. She was also 100% convinced it was my dog, even though there are always tons of loose dogs, cats, and wildlife wandering around and no doubt traveling through her unfenced backyard. In my peripheral vision, she got into her SUV, backed out of her driveway, then parked it along the street directly behind me and just idled there, staring. The note then went on a weird, long tirade about the previous family to live in my house, saying I was Anthrodeb, as if I'd have any idea at all what that is even supposed to mean, then concluded in some odd insults and some implied not quite threats. This is the closest thing we ever had to a conversation at this point. I can understand not wanting a dog using the bathroom in her yard, but this was a bit of an extreme reaction, as this was literally the first time I'd even heard of there being a problem. A simple note would have done, but this note was insane. She was still staring behind me. I decided to try to ignore her and just go to my house. That's when she shouted out her window, "Are you playing a game?" The reaction made no sense. "Are you nuts?" I replied, as I officially ran out of patience. She shouted more nonsense and insults at me while blocking my driveway, which was right next to the mailboxes, with her vehicle, while I repeatedly told her to leave before I called the cops. This went back and forth like this for a while, but she eventually sped off when I pulled my cell phone out. Later, my boyfriend, who had not been home at this time this happened, had a chat with the neighbors. He said they seemed agreeable and reasonable and basically dismissed me of just being dramatic. The woman told a very different version of events, of course. I was annoyed that my boyfriend wasn't taking me seriously, but let it go. I think he just wanted to keep getting along with the man next door, as they sometimes borrow tools. They speak to him a lot differently than how they speak to me. They don't do anything rude to me while he's around. In fact, they don't speak to me when he's around at all. They always wait for him to be away. Anyway, I mostly just avoid them. Sometimes, the woman stares at me, but I just ignore her. Until recently, I've been mostly successful. Here's the creepy story. I don't sleep well at night when I'm home alone, and I'm always home alone now because my boyfriend is out of the country on business for months at a time. I often feel like there's someone just outside my house or at my door. Sometimes, my dogs act up at odd hours, but I never see anyone. I keep my house alarm armed and my pistol on my nightstand. The other night was one such night. I didn't sleep well and kept having a sinking feeling that something was wrong. Anyway, I got out of bed at about 2 a.m. because I thought I was scheduled to work at 3 a.m. I had mostly given up on getting a restful sleep then anyway. As I left my house, I heard something to my left, the direction of my neighbor's house, but didn't see anything. I was always nervous in my driveway because the motion sensor light was broken, but there was always a lot of darkness between my door and my truck, so I always moved quickly to my driveway. I got in my truck and went to work. It turned out that I misread my schedule and didn't work at 3 that morning after all. Annoyed at the mistake, but grateful I'd get to go home and sleep a little more before the actual start of my shift at 7, I went home. I pulled into my driveway and didn't see anything in the beam of my truck's headlights. I always look around my truck before getting out. I turned the headlight off and got out. I took a few steps ahead of my truck, and then all of a sudden a large man called out to me, shouted really, from the shadows at the corner of my house. He scared me so bad that I screamed, reached for my pepper spray, and fell down. Not useful. He apologized in a tone that didn't sound sorry at all. It was my neighbor, and that wasn't much of a relief. Apparently it was my fault that he occasionally found trash in his yard, in windy Colorado. Complaining about this seemed to be a lot more important issue than scaring the heck out of me while I'm alone at night. He showed no real concern or realization that was even wrong at all. Again, I have no problem with neighbors bringing issues to my attention, but seriously, hey, can you make sure trash from your bins isn't blown into my yard? Is not a question that takes 10 minutes. nor is it one that needs to be addressed at 3 in the morning. I nod in agreement to keep the peace, but I know the trash isn't mine. We live in a windy area. Trash gets blown around in people's yards all the time. No big deal. But he would just not stop going on about it. He kept needlessly repeating himself and made some not quite but kinda threat about getting along. Think about the lines of, "It would be a shame if something were to happen," type sort of threats. He was keeping me busy. I didn't even notice his wife flank me. Before I even knew she was there, she appeared from the shadows by a tree. She wanted to yell at me about some eggs. A few weeks ago, I found a bunch of eggs smashed on the road near our shelved mailbox. As the carton was right next to them, I thought the carton had obviously just been dropped, not that someone was trying to egg anything. I assumed my neighbor had dropped the eggs on her way to get the mail and just left them. She denies this, but I still think that's the most likely explanation because no one else has any reason to be out at our mailbox with eggs. But I didn't care enough to say anything to her about it at the time, so I just let it go and forgot all about it. Now she was accusing me of leaving eggs around. Again, inexplicably expressing the grievance at 3 AM. Weird that she hadn't brought it up weeks ago when it happened, but I know why she didn't. My boyfriend was still here then. My boyfriend has been away on business for several weeks now, long enough for them to have noticed his absence. They were also probably aware that my motion sensor light was out. They sure seemed to know how to avoid my headlight beams. Being surprisingly patient, I explained that I knew nothing about the eggs. I mentioned that I later found a lot of the shells in my yard and figured a squirrel must have carried them there. She proudly informed me that she tossed them onto my yard herself. Apparently she thought that was okay, but someone dropping them in the first place isn't. Anyway, this is where I started to get over my shock a bit and started getting pissed. Initially, I had been somewhat relieved that the man in the shadows had been my neighbor, not some random crazy person, but now I was pissed. I had now been outside with them for like 20 minutes, while they accused me about stupid stuff. While I tried to be polite and agreeable even though I had nothing to do with it, but now everything wrong with the situation had just kicked in. I eventually remembered that I don't actually have to put up with any of this and cut her off mid-rant and said, "It's 3 AM, I'm going home, good night," and turned on my heel. I heard her say something in an unkind tone as I left, but didn't catch what it was. They had staked out my house, waited for my boyfriend to leave, and long enough to be sure he was gone, all to complain about some insane stuff long after it supposedly even happened. If they have concerns, surely there are better times to address them than at 3 AM. What were they doing out at 3 AM anyway? And that man had totally purposely hidden a shadow at the corner of my house where he could avoid my headlights. and didn't reveal himself until I was out of my truck and exposed. And shouldn't the woman have walked up beside her husband, not gone around while I was distracted? They kept doing odd behavior, never enough that they're doing anything illegal or anything to report the police. But none of this is normal behavior. Honestly, I think these complaints are just excuses and they're really just taking the opportunity to intimidate me. I think they're messing with me on purpose. Then again, I could be wrong. Either way, I will be installing a motion light soon. I was so shaken up and had my adrenaline so high from someone scaring me from a blind spot by my house. Because seriously, that could have been someone else and a whole lot worse. The story starts several years ago. Me and my friend's interest in urban exploration. I was a junior in high school at the time, which was when everyone started to earn a lot more freedom, so we took the chance to be out late whenever we could. Now, keep in mind that I live in a major city in central Colorado, so the nightlife is never lacking. We could always find something to do, and were especially drawn if there was an element of danger. We wouldn't always plan these trips, but we made sure that if we were going into any old building in the dark, we would have a knife and a flashlight for safety. We never really had to defend ourselves, but we came very close one evening. It must have been around November, because there wasn't yet snow on the ground, but it was actually a chilly evening. Directly across the street from the abandoned hospital, which we have hypothesized is still around from the TB area, is a hospital that is newer and in use. The two are connected by an underground tunnel, which I can only assume was a way to move bodies without alerting the patients. We had been inside the hospital a few times, but never found anything strange, only the occasional sign of others having been or lived there. What was piquing our interest that night was the abandoned library next door to the hospital. It was connected, but only by exterior walls. To get inside, you could not cut through the hospital, but instead had to hop over a tall wall and climb a very high fence. A few of us had backpacks, containing the aforementioned safety precautions and a couple bottles of water, so nothing too heavy or valuable that would get damaged when tossed over the obstacles before us. A little ways off the road, it was dark if you clung to the buildings. We did for a while before stepping behind a small patch of shrubbery, which we determined was an easy way over the first wall since the other way around to gain access was by a chained, unclimbable gate at the bottom of a set of stairs facing away from the ledge. Both were parallel with the library, so when tucked back in that corner behind the bushes, No one could see us from the street. I don't believe I went first, but I did not remain behind to be last over that wall. It was too high up for me to jump and haul myself over, so I resorted to stepping on a pipe jutting out somewhere lower along the wall. It gave me a bit of a needed boost, and soon I was up and over, moving into the library's courtyard. Another girl and I waited for our 2 other girlfriends to join us. Upon an initial glance over at the courtyard, there was no obvious way in. To our right was a dilapidated fountain, which I took joy in imagining springing forward a spray of water from its detailed stonework in the brighter summer months, people laughing and talking with the surrounding trees bringing them shade. Now, however, it had been in long disuse, and the earth at our feet was cold and hard. There were no signs of another soul for years, save the 15 chain link fence directly in front of us separating the courtyard in half. I could tell it had seen the same weather as the rest of the courtyard, because the metal showed no signs of rust. That must be our way in, we agreed, because with a fence like that, someone obviously wanted to keep us out. We hurled our bags over the fence, hearing them clank on the ground rather silently due to their lightness. I was the third over, because I have a slight fear of climbing and it took me a bit to mentally prepare myself. I made it to the top of the fence in short time, then sat at the top straddling it with a leg on either side. I had 2 girls on the other side in front of me, and one behind me who was telling me to hurry up. I spent a good couple minutes up there doing another mental preparation and some deep breathing, then climbed down to wait for the last girl. At the time, I was thinking that had been one of the scariest things I've done in a while, because I tend to avoid climbing at all costs. Of course, this is an irrational fear, as I have never fallen, but that phobic fear didn't even compare to what happened next. The last girl's feet hit the ground and all 4 of us split up into the smaller half of the courtyard, looking for any kind of entrance. We decided that breaking a window would be too loud and draw unwanted attention, not to mention we could really get cut up, so that wasn't an option. Searching for a little longer, we didn't find anything that looked remotely plausible, until we found a grate near the base of where 2 walls met. I couldn't believe we hadn't noticed it before, and upon closer inspection, the grate was already moved slightly from its resting place, so it would be easy to lift the rest of the way. The smallest and least fearful of our group went first. After moving the grate, there was a small drop down. It was no more than 3 feet down and 2 feet wide, but inside there was another drop down where we could see into the library basement. She hopped down into the small, square landing, only to almost immediately freeze. We looked amongst ourselves, wondering what was wrong. "There's a guy down there," she said. "What? Where?" "I could see his outline," she said. I leaned forward and tried to make out a shape, but it was further down than my line of sight and it was too dark. "Hello?" she called out. He responded the same, asking who we were. "Just a couple of chicks," she spat out bluntly. What he said next sent chills down my spine. It was as if I could feel the darkness radiating out of the hole in the ground. All of a sudden, it was very still and quiet, like the darkness had spilled out and weighed all of us down in that gloomy courtyard. He said in what I can only describe as a lustful tone gripping with ill intent, "I'm addicted to following the sound of women's voices." My friend looked over at us blankly, but there was nervousness underneath. Unease. Something in his voice sounded like it wasn't an empty threat, like he wasn't just saying something creepy to get us to leave. She looked back to where he was and said slowly, "That's not cool." The man under that dark earth began laughing maniacally, and not in the kind of way a really good actor does, in the way that we could feel his utter insanity hit us like stale air. We looked at each other for what felt like hours in that gloomy courtyard, but I knew it was only a couple seconds, because we all exchanged without even speaking that we had to get out of there, and now. I was not about to risk some crazy guy coming after us, even if we did outnumber him. The friend scrambled up out of the landing, and I was never over a fence faster in my life. 15-foot potential fall, and I didn't even have time to think about it. We didn't stop running until we were on the street and halfway down the block out of breath. So guy that was down there, let's not meet again. It was 2012, and my best friend Hannah had convinced me to join her on a weekend trip up north. She had, after searching for the longest time, found her dream car and was planning on traveling the 900-kilometer to the very north of Sweden to buy it. It was a second-hand door Suzuki Vitara in a purplish kind of color, and I must admit I didn't share her obsession with it. But with her being the closest thing to a sister that I will ever get, I was happy to join her nonetheless. Hannah and I have always had each other, from the cradle and onwards. Sharing each other's love for adventure, we have traveled the world together. At the time this happened, we were both 21 and had recently returned from a trip in Asia. The man who was selling her the car had agreed to meet us at the small airport in Umeå when we arrived shortly before lunchtime and it had started to snow heavily. The first snow of the season, no less. The parking lot was almost empty, and when I saw the man standing outside the Vitara, I felt immediately concerned. He was dressed like a hunter. A lot of people in this area of the country live a lifestyle with hunting and fishing, so nothing strange with that really, but still, there was something about him that made me uneasy. He was nice though, smiling and waving to us. shaking hands with us both before walking us around the car and pointing all the tiny little flaws. He showed us the work he had done on the car and showed the paperwork from the recently done engine repairs. He made the impression that he didn't want to hide anything. On the contrary, he made a show out of being very forthcoming and honest. The snowing had now intensified and we were getting cold. He opened the car door for us and said, "I got the paperwork at home. Let's close the deal over some coffee." Against all my instincts, I climbed in after Hannah, both of us now trapped in the back seat. I had no reason to feel threatened by this man who had been nothing but pleasant to us, other than the alarm bells going off inside my head. I can't tell what it was that made me feel that way, but there must have been some sign that something was wrong, something that my subconscious tuned to. The man was constantly talking. He showed the stereo, told us about the features of the car, about the places we drove past, about the wildlife and the nature. There was not a silent moment. After about 20 minutes, I started to notice that we were in no way moving in the direction of civilization. Instead, it seemed we were driving further and further into the vast wilderness. It struck me that he had us in the back of a two-door car, diving us into unknown territory and no one knew where we were. I looked at Hannah, who was happily listening to the man telling stories about the area, and I noticed she didn't look at all worried. Maybe I was totally overreacting. We drove past a group of people standing by the side of the road, hunters planning their day or taking a break maybe. This truly is very different Sweden compared to the city. The car finally stopped outside a small wooden cottage with no neighboring houses, apart from a small cabin that we drove past a few hundred meters down the road, but it had looked empty. We followed the man inside. He was still talking non-stop and continued to do so until the moment the door closed behind us. Hannah kept asking things about the car, and I could sense that her voice had a new undertone now, a thin, sharp tenseness that made me wonder if she too had started to feel that something wasn't right. "I'll put the kettle on," he said, and as he passed us to go into the kitchen, he let his hand touch Hannah's hair and he smiled smugly. "May I use the bathroom?" I asked politely and made my way to the door with a little red heart on. I was washing my hands when I saw something in the stained bathroom mirror. Something was behind the water cistern. I pulled out a rolled up plastic folder and as I turned the pages, I felt my blood run cold. It was very violent pictures that looked like had been cut out from magazines, and they were glued to the paper, surrounded by cut up pieces of handwritten text. Put it together made a horrifying story about how a woman was lured into a car with the promise of getting to buy the car cheaply, and then it quickly turned into a horror story. I know this will sound silly, but when we traveled together, Hannah and I had a code word for whenever we felt it was time to get out of a situation. We had never needed to use it, just joked about it, but now it came in handy. I walked out of the bathroom and looked at Hannah and said, "Potatoes. We forgot to buy potatoes. And that's too bad, because we really need some." The look on my face must have told her that the situation was no joke, and she said, "Oh, should we get some as soon as possible?" "The sooner the better," I replied. Hannah, always pretty and charming and capable of great acting, casually walked over to the man in the kitchen, tapped his shoulder and said, "Excuse me, but I was wondering if I can go have a quick look at the cam belt." He upped something about it being in good shape and handed over the keys. We got into the car and speeded off faster than the weather strictly speaking allowed. We left the car at the airport and hoped we hadn't made a terrible mistake. What if he reported it stolen? It would be embarrassing to explain to the police. But nothing happened. He didn't follow us, didn't report it. We had to take the train since we had no plane tickets. The original plan had been to take the car home, and we didn't want to linger closer to the airport in case he came looking for us. Later, Hannah asked what made me use the code word, and I told her about what I found. It might have just been a fantasy, a sick game, and maybe he would never done anything to us. But right then and there, I was convinced we would have died if we didn't get out. I'm glad Hannah didn't need any convincing or proof, just the code word. I truly think that if we hadn't talked about it so many times before, about how we would handle a situation where we need to get out fast, things would have ended differently. Both of us knew that either of us ever used the code word, it's time to get out, no questions asked, just move. Alright, so that's it. Hope you enjoyed these stories. If you did, consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. But as always,
Have a nice day.